Well, the message this morning has a title. That title is Pagan Practices and a Personal Levite. So this is one of the more interesting instances in the book of Judges. And what we're looking at here in the book of Judges is the first chapter, chapter 1, is kind of this introduction. It transitions from the book of Joshua, how the people have come into the land and are taking their territory, and it gives commentary that largely most of the tribes were unsuccessful in fully capturing their allotted portion from the Lord in the land, and so there were still a lot of enemies in the land and threats, and so chapters 2 through 16 deal with these external threats. So there's the Edomites and the Moabites and the Amorites and the Philistines. So you have these external forces and these attacks, and they're having to fend off attacks, and they cry out to the Lord, and the Lord's using it to draw his people back to him. Things just get, it's, turning up the screws, turning up the pressure to the point where they finally cry out to him. He raises up a judge to deliver them. The judge pushes back against the enemy. They're given a time of reprieve, and then this cycle repeats, and it's just this downhill spiral. And now, here we have a huge transition as we go into chapter 17 from the external threats that they were facing from these foreign oppressors to now the internal threats that they were dealing with when it came to the spiritual condition in Israel. And so we're going to see in these final chapters just how bad it was in Israel during this time, the time of the judges. So I want to begin. This is a helpful quote from Arnold Fruchtenbaum. Actually, I'll put this graphic up here again. We'll go back to this, but we're going to be dealing with the hill country of Ephraim right here. This is sort of where we're going to be focusing in this passage. This quote from Arnold Fruchtenbaum, he says, "It was in this territory, the location of Ephraim, that the tabernacle at Shiloh was located. And yet the tabernacle did not influence this man who we're going to read about, Micah. It didn't influence his spiritual life. If this was true for Ephraim, in whose territory Shiloh was located, one can speculate how much more it might have been true for the more distant tribes." And so put that graphic back up there. If right here at Shiloh is where the tabernacle is located, and the spiritual condition of Ephraim was horrendous, then imagine the tribes living farther away, what it must have been like in their regions. So getting into our passage, now there was a man from the mountains of Ephraim, the hill country, whose name was Micah. And in the Hebrew it actually says Micaiah is his full name. It's given that way in the first couple of instances of his name. And then throughout the rest of the passage, it gets shortened to Micah. So maybe something similar to what we would do today. Somebody's name is Michael, we might call him Mike. That was his name. And so we're introduced to him here in this passage. We're told where he's from, and then we're told something about him, and it goes from introduction to not good quickly. So he said, this man Micah said to his mother, "The 1,100 shekels of silver that were taken from you," this is a vast sum of money, "and on which you put a curse, even saying it in my ears, here is the silver with me. Well, I took it." And his mother says, "May you be blessed by the Lord, my son." So this is a wealthy family. This is a mother and son, and she has this 1,100 shekels of silver, which is a very large sum of money. It goes missing, and she's obviously upset, as any of us would be if we have, a stash of money somewhere in the house and we go to retrieve it and it's gone. And somebody has clearly gone in and stolen it. And so she puts out this curse, and this rattles the man, Micah. He realizes that he's now subject to this curse. And so he comes clean, and he tells her, "Well, it was me. I took it." And so then she says, "Blessed by Jehovah, the Lord, my son. So she quickly flips on a dime and she turns her curse into a blessing. She tries to quickly cancel it out. And let's keep reading here. So when he had returned the 1,100 shekels of silver to his mother said, I had wholly dedicated the silver from my hand to the Lord for my son. This is sounding suspicious. Maybe she had, maybe she hadn't. I don't know. To make a carved image and a molded image. Now, therefore, I will return it to you. So in her mind, dedicating this money to the Lord means it should be used to make an idol. And you're already going, okay, what? So it says, thus he returned the silver to his mother, and she took 200 shekels of silver and gave them to the silversmith, and he made it into a carved image and a molded image, and they were in the house of Micah. So what happened to the other 900, we're not sure. But this is what transpires, and these silver images are made, these idols, and they go into Micah's house. So he kind of gets a portion of this silver that he had stolen in a very interesting way. But right off the bat, we're seeing some obvious problems. That with regards to Micah stealing this money from his mother, her idolatrous perspective, and then what actually happens is the creation of these idols, and then his house becoming an idolatrous worship center, which we're going to learn more about in our passage. We've at least got 5 of the 10 commandments broken right here in this quick couple of verses. Number 1, do not steal. Well, he stole it from her. Do not covet. Well, he obviously really wanted this money that was not his, and that led him to steal it. Have no other gods before me. That's a questionable one because there's obviously some outside influence from the Canaanite worship practices. Make no idols. There they are, commissioning the silversmith to make idols. And honor father and mother. He wasn't honoring his mother if he was stealing from her. So it's just, this really gets in these first few verses right to the heart of the matter of this problem in Israel that was economic, it was political, it was military, but at the heart of it all was spiritual. And they had gone far astray from the Lord's revealed will in his word. Even right off the 10 Commandments, which we know so well and which used to have a lot of reverence in society and would be posted frequently in public buildings and courthouses and schools, and now those have fallen by the wayside, and I think that's a tragic thing because what a great reminder it is to have those things in front of us as a glaring example of, at least if you don't violate if you violate other things, don't violate these. Let's continue on into verses 5 and 6. The man Micah had a shrine and made an ephod and household idols. These are teraphim, household idols, and he consecrated one of his sons who became a priest. Now he's an Ephraimite. He's not anywhere near the tribe of Levi in terms of his family lineage, and so he commissions his son as his own priest. This is in direct violation of Deuteronomy chapter 12, and if we flipped over there, I might just do that really quickly. Deuteronomy 12 spells this out in very specific terms. Verse 5 says, but you shall seek the Lord at the place which the Lord your God will choose from all your tribes to establish his name there for his dwelling, and there you shall come. So there was a specific place that they were to come to worship the Lord where God would choose, not where they would choose. And this was in direct violation of that. They were choosing the worship place of their own choosing. Likewise, in verse 8, you shall not do at all what we are doing here today, every man doing whatever is right in his own eyes. And we're about to see that coming up in the next verse as well. Everyone was doing whatever they saw fit to do. So it was a mess spiritually in Israel. And so the setup here is the priesthood, he ordains his own son to be his own personal priest. And it says in verse 6, in those days there was no king in Israel. Every man did what was right in his own eyes. So we're seeing that there were some real glaring problems in Israel. And what this highlights is also, we don't want to miss this, the importance of what they needed. And they were at the point where it was becoming more and more and more obvious that they needed a king in Israel. So yes, on one level, if they had come on board with the idea that God, the Lord God, was their king, that they were to live in a theocracy, and that they were to honor him and follow his ways, things could have been amazing, but they never came anywhere close to that. And so the only real remedy was to have a human king, and the Lord was making provision, setting those things in place. And the book of Judges testifies to the need of a king to come. And so this statement, there was no king in Israel, is followed by every man did what was right in his own eyes. And this is actually how chapter 21, the very end of the book of Judges, concludes as well, is with these same words. And so these are kind of like, you can think of them as bookends. And so everything in between is filling in the picture of this particular statement and its various ramifications. So the people of Israel were to do what was right in God's eyes, not in their own eyes. However, if they had a king who understood that he was under God's authority, then he could take action against those in the country who would attempt to lead the nation into something else. And what recurs again and again is this syncretistic Canaanite-style idolatry, or this alternative of personal worship practices that the person just randomly chose, such as we see here with this man Micah. So everyone was doing what was right in their own eyes, and the highlight of this particular passage is spiritually. They were doing what was right in their own eyes spiritually. And why was that such a problem? Well, Micah and his mother were representative of what was taking place not only in the hill country of Ephraim, but all over the land of Israel during the time of the Judges. It was really spiritual chaos. It was spiritual anarchy. It was a mess. So let's look now at, I just want to throw this out there because I think this is worth noting, that there is a little bit of a parallel in our day, and I've noticed it as a pastor, and I might as well speak to it because it's something very, very common. And that is with regard to ordination. Why do we have ordinations for people going into the ministry? Because it's prescribed in Scripture. Well, what about when it comes to something like marriage? We're seeing it on TV programs and in relationship, with friends and whatnot, that it's become more and more common to, let's say, have an officiant for a wedding, go online to the, Universal Church of whatever, and quickly download a certificate and perform a wedding, which, again, weddings are not prescribed in Scriptures. It's not a biblical absolute of who has to perform a wedding. But if you go back historically and see sort of trace how that came about, you had a situation where it was difficult to keep track of who was married to who, and were they married to the same person today as yesterday, and it was a mess. And so the church stepped in and they started keeping records. So Joe was married to Mary, and they logged it in the church log, and it was recorded, and everybody could refer to that, and they were eliminating confusion. And that became, over time, the priest could then or the pastor, the bishop, whoever it was, could verify, maybe I want to see some more, something a little more concrete. So did you guys actually commit to one another? Did you actually make vows? Did you enter into vows? Is this a solemn commitment? And they would demonstrate that, yes, they had. So that would be recorded. And pretty soon that turned into a religious ceremony of entering into vows together, and it being overseen and made sort of official through the church. Then over time, even in as our country was being established, that was the common practices. Marriages were recorded through the churches. But then as everything else happens in society, government will go in and take control of more and more and more and more. And so the government decided to take on that role from the church to the government so that they could clearly have their own records of who was married to who and such. And then they would sort of grandfather in the clergy as the ones who were therefore authorized by the state to perform the marriages. And that's what we have the arrangement still to this day, to where clergy members can officiate on behalf of the government, and it's legally recognized. And so you can kind of trace that progression and see how that's happened. But now the state has become very, very confused into what even constitutes a marriage. Does it even need to be a man and a woman? What would be the conditions of such a marriage? Can anybody just, marry and divorce on a whim? And the government has really had a difficult time because they don't have a biblical foundation of establishing what is a proper marriage. And so without God's standard, it becomes quickly a mess. And we see that bleeding into then who's even overseeing the saying of the vows, and it can just be anybody's, buddy, and it's quickly become just a very different scenario than the clarity that used to be there. Anyways, I think we see a little bit of the conditions of spiritual chaos that we see in Judges, even in our own day. Obviously not to this extreme, but there is some similarity to note. Looking to verse 7, now there was a young man from Bethlehem in Judah, of the family of Judah. He was a Levite and was staying there. This brings up so many questions. So who is this young man? Well, we're told that he was of the tribe of Levi, but there were 48 Levitical cities scattered throughout Israel, and the Levites would be assigned to these Levitical cities, and they would live there, and it would basically provide spiritual coverage, kind of like we think of churches or parishes stationed around the place. And so this man, though, he was not living in one of these Levitical cities, which that raises questions of its own. He was living in Bethlehem. Bethlehem was not a Levitical city, so what was he doing there, and what does this tell us about the spiritual condition in Israel? Well, this is odd. This is an odd detail. As the passage goes on, we're going to get more information about him. His name is Jonathan, and he's from the line of Kohath. We know that because he's of the line of Moses and Gershom. And so he's from the line of Kohath, which means that his Levitical cities that he would have been assigned to would be the cities located in Ephraim, Dan, and western Manasseh. Well, here we find him living down in Judah and then transiting, and he's going to make his way. Verse 8, he departed from the city of Bethlehem in Judah to stay wherever he could find a place. So what this tells us is that he was not being looked to as a spiritual authority, as a Levite, and he was also not being supported financially, as the nation of Israel was very explicitly charged with doing, of taking care of the tribe of Levi. They were the spiritual leaders, and they were to support them. So he's obviously looking for a way to support himself. So it says he came to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, as he sojourned. So again, this is a family. We know something about them. They're a wealthy, prominent family in the hill country of Ephraim. They probably are pretty easy to pick out. And he goes. And verse 9, it says he journeyed, and Micah said to him, "Where do you come from?" So he said, "Well, I'm a Levite from Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm on my way to find a place to stay." So he's just kind of making his way around, trying to find some kind of a place to stay in some way to support himself, since the nation is not supporting him. Verse 10, Micah said to him, "Well, dwell with me, and be a father and a priest to me, and I will give you 10 shekels of silver per year, a suit of clothes, and your sustenance." So the Levite went in. So there's this job offer that comes about. Micah offers this Levite employment. And again, all priests were Levites, but not all Levites could be priests. They had to specifically be of the line of Aaron, and this man was not. But he's offered here by this man Micah a modest salary, room and board, and a clothing allowance. The wording here, he says, he gives him this offer to be a priest, a father and a priest to me. It's la'av v'lo kohen in Hebrew. It's the idea is he's given a position of priestly authority and honor. So he says, I'm offering you this honored position. This is something very desirable. Why don't you come here, and you're going to have respect, and I'm going to take care of you financially. But in reality, if we want to just think about this in quick terms, he would have had no authority and no honor because he was simply a hired employee who didn't even from the start meet the biblical qualifications for such an office. Like, none of this worked. This wasn't in Shiloh. This wasn't at the tabernacle. He wasn't of the line of Aaron. None of this worked in any way, but the two of them come to this arrangement that works for them because everybody did what was right in their own eyes spiritually. So one thing we also know about this Levite is that he was a generation younger than this man Micah. And so these are, and we can get that from, I think, looking at the next verse. The Levite was content to dwell with the man, and the young man became like one of his sons to him. Let's keep going here. So Micah consecrated the Levite, and the young man became his priest and lived in the house of Micah. So his son gets out of priestly duty, and now he's got a Levite living in his house to fulfill this role. Then Micah said, "Now I know that the Lord will be good to me since I have a Levite as a priest." This is a sketchy scenario that we're looking at here. One of the things that we can tell about both of these individuals, Micah and this personal Levite, is that they were both self-focused and lovers of money. And they were both characteristically transactional types of people. That was their philosophy of life. That's how they went through life, was basically just looking for whatever was going to accomplish what they wanted to accomplish on a transactional level, and in using another person in order to get what they wanted. And these types of people are always going to find each other because they function well together on a surface level, in a shallow, symbiotic kind of a relationship. However, the relationship is inherently tenuous because it's purely transactional, and it's extremely brittle. And it's easily broken as soon as a better offer comes along. And so we also know that Micah was no stranger to criminal behavior. What about the Levite? Well, what we're going to see from him is, let's ask another question. What was his relationship to criminality? Did he engage in it in himself? Or did he sort of condone it? Or was he just sort of apathetic toward it? And in the case of a transactional type relationship where both parties, and I would say that he was sort of ambivalent to it, it seems, this Levite, is that these kinds of situations where both people are either engaged in criminality or are okay with it, is that the relationship can, if it's both parties that are in this boat, it can quickly turn explosive when both parties turn on each other. So it's kind of like playing with fire at this point. But notice Micah's response here in verse 13. He says, "Now I know that the Lord will be good to me since I have a Levite as priest." So this really is the summation in this statement of his superstitious worldview. In our modern day, it would be something like slap a Bible verse on it, and it's magically covered with God's blessing, right? It doesn't matter how unbiblical the behavior is, we're going to slap a Bible verse on it, and it's going to be good to go. So this is a superstitious version of Christianity, really a veneer that is so many times and in so many instances within Christianity and within churches practiced today, and it's very, very sad. It's shameful. It's practiced in place of faithful, life-shaping, biblical Christianity. So the Levite here is Micah's good luck charm, who he believes having him in his house as his own personal Levite is going to guarantee him God's blessing. And we're going to see that that was not the case for Micah, really, or for the Levite as well. This was setting up a real mess. So we're going to keep moving here. And in this transition here between chapters, I like this quote from Fruchtenbaum, who says, chapter 17 reveals the apostasy of the individual. Chapter 18 shows the apostasy of the tribe, and this is going to be the tribe of Dan. So the whole tribe comes into view here in chapter 18. In those days, there was no king in Israel. That phrase gets repeated. It doesn't get the tagline of everyone did what was right in their own eyes, because it's actually focusing us in on something different at this point. And in those days, the tribe of Dan, of the Danites, was seeking an inheritance for itself to dwell in, for until that day, their inheritance among the tribes of Israel had not fallen to them. So here we have, in those days, there was no king in Israel, indicating that there was no political and military leader with a strong central government. Once they would have a king, they would have a commander-in-chief who would command a national army that would be ideally suited to conquer the enemy and finally give a tribe like Dan their inheritance that the Lord had given to them that they had never taken possession of. So we find this in Joshua and in Judges, the early chapters, of how Dan failed to take possession of their territory. And they seem to have fared worse than any other tribe in this way, in that they never really seem to have expelled any enemies or gained any territory. It's really a bad situation for the tribe of Dan. Where did they go wrong? Well, there was a promise issued again and again and again that if they walked with the Lord, if they were faithful in obeying the law and trusting the Lord, that he would go before them and he would fight their battles, and they would have nothing to worry about. They would expel their enemies. And it wouldn't be because of their military strength. It would be because God was going before them. But that tells you that their spiritual condition has been a mess for a long time, and it's just gone from bad to worse. But they're stuck in this situation where they have no territory. So the elders of Israel at this point needed to have stepped in and put some sense into the tribe of Dan to keep them from abandoning their territorial allotment and now seeking a new one somewhere else, which is what they're about to do. So the tribe of Dan, that was Samson's tribe as well. So this is a natural progression from chapter 16, where we left off with Samson, to dealing with the same tribe who, and that probably explains a lot of why Samson was so often in the land of the Philistines. His tribe of Dan really didn't have any territory of their own to speak of. We find him in Judah, and we find him in Philistia, but we never really find him in Dan. Well, they never seem to have occupied that territory in any kind of meaningful way. And so they're boxed in. They're boxed in between the Amorites and the Philistines on the west. The tribe of Ephraim is bordering them in the north, the tribe of Judah on the south, and a tiny bit the tribe of Benjamin on the east. And so they're boxed in with no territory. Because they never took their territory, they're in a bad spot. So Dan, what we see from them here is they're without territory, and they've become restless. They're discontent, they're restless, and they're covetous. And that's what's going to start to rise to the surface. Not only are they upset at not having their own territory, they start seeking inheritance somewhere else, even if they have to dispossess someone else to get it. So their covetous desire for greener grass, we see that in the Danites, and we're like, oh, that's terrible. Those terrible people. But I want to say this morning that same attitude can burn within us just as strong, maybe strong like a wildfire. We know how much those things rage around here. So here's a takeaway for us this morning, that the grass is not greener elsewhere. We could just end it right there, but discontentment can become the most bitter poison. Joy and contentment are found not in the future, but in the present. I think we miss that perspective very frequently. God's will for us is that we change our perspective from discontentment to contentment. With that perspective, every obstacle for us becomes an opportunity for God. So a great New Year's challenge for us to hit a reset button when it comes to our own joy, fulfillment, contentment, and to abandon the idea that the future is where contentment lies, as opposed to now, or that the grass is always going to be greener somewhere else. We just need to go chasing after it when it's probably the greenest right where we're at until the Lord moves us very clearly somewhere else. Let's look at verses 2 and 3. So the children of Dan sent 5 men of their family from their territory, men of valor from Zorah and Eshtaol, to spy out the land and search it. They said to them, "Go search the land." So they went to the mountains of Ephraim, to the house of Micah, and lodged there. Verse 3 says, while they were there at the house of Micah, they recognized the voice of the young Levite. They turned aside and said to him, "Who brought you here? Like, what are you doing here? What are you doing in this place? What do you have here?" So the tribe of Dan had really primarily failed spiritually. They failed to be faithful in their covenant with the Lord, and remember, he had guaranteed their victory going into the land. You can read all about this in Joshua chapters 23 and 24. And specifically, the tribe of Dan's failure can be found in Judges chapter 1, verse 34. So the tribe of Dan, to have to flee from the Amorites and now to reject the territory that God gave them, and now taking it a step further in their discontentment to actually covet land that belonged to some other people somewhere else, was them directly ignoring the stated will of God for them. God gave them this territory, now they are rejecting it. So despite the affirming words of Micah's mother, God has now begun implementing consequences for Micah in place of the blessing that he expects. So we're seeing this kind of slowly unfold before us of what's coming, what's happening. So the Danites, they recognize this Levite somehow. So there's some commentators that think, well, he had been living in Bethlehem, and that's in the tribe of Judah, so maybe he had a Judean accent. They recognize his accent. But that's one possibility, or it's possible they've met him before. They've run into him before. They're not far in these towns from the tribe of Judah. Maybe they've gone over there and they've run into him before, or maybe he's ventured into their land before. Somehow they seem to kind of have this existing relationship. They recognize his voice, and, "Whoa, what are you doing here?" is the response. Let's look at verse 4. He said to them, "Thus and so Micah did for me. He has hired me, and I have become his priest." Thus and so is kind of an interesting rendering, but it basically refers to what we've just been reading about, this account of how this Levite has come to work for this man Micah, and the salary arrangement and whatnot that they've agreed to. So if the Danites, at this point, if they're truly, let's move on. So they said to him, "Please inquire of God, that we may know whether the journey on which we go will be prosperous." So if they really wanted to know God's will, they would have gone not to this random house in the hill country of Ephraim. They would have gone to Shiloh, and they would have found the priest, who is the legitimate priest on duty to talk to. But they're perfectly happy settling for this random personal Levite who's on salary with this man Micah, who doesn't meet any of the biblical requirements. That seems to not really faze them. And so they seek God's counsel, and they get a response from this Levite. And the priest said to them, "Go in peace. The presence of the Lord will be with you on your way." Now this is interesting because he tells them, first of all, go with shalom. The idea is he sort of hints that God is pleased with them and with what they're doing. And so he said, God's got you, is basically his go-to response. And so this is a very vague and strange statement of blessing, and it seems as if this priest is kind of hedging his bets. So he's not really willing to say, yes, God is in this, God's going to give you this particular territory, because maybe in his mind, maybe God will, maybe God won't. So he just kind of tells them, go in peace, which is completely ironic, because these are some of the least peaceful people you're ever going to meet. They were violent criminal thugs. And he tells them, basically, God is with you. So it's kind of this prophecy that could go either way, very similar to the pagan oracles. And these are pagan-minded thugs, these 5 individuals from the tribe of Judah. They're on this reconnaissance mission. And I think we observe something that's easy to relate to. Let's look at verse 7. So the 5 men departed and went to Laish. Now, we'll talk about where Laish was, but they saw the people who were there, how they dwelt safely in the manner of the Sidonians, quiet and secure. There were no rulers in the land who might put them to shame for anything. They were far from the Sidonians, and they had no ties with anyone. So basically, they're pretty isolated, and they don't really have anyone who's going to pitch a fit. Nobody who's really going to come to their defense. They're just kind of sitting ducks at this point is their assessment. Now, what's interesting here when they go and they get this counsel from this personal Levite is that they do something that we observe so common. I have observed this very commonly as a pastor. So it's typical that maybe this is kind of human nature. When we've made up our minds about something that we want to do, that we will skip the step of earnestly seeking how to know if our decision lines up with the will of God as revealed in His Word, or seeking biblical counsel from those He's placed in positions of spiritual authority. So the first thing that I've observed, and that I think happens commonly, is that someone will just skip that step. They'll skip seeking biblical counsel if in their minds it seems like it's going to come back contrary to the choice that they've already made. It just seems too risky, so they'll just skip it. What also happens is that people might go seek biblical counsel if they've already made up their mind in advance, but they'll do so in a way they'll just automatically ignore that counsel if it doesn't validate the choice that they've already made. And I've had people in my office, and it's a sad thing because you see the wheels turning in their heads, and you're just like, they don't have any interest in actually hearing what the Bible has to say to them on this. Or C, they'll seek out an unbiblical authority, which is what we see here in this passage, or a wishy-washy counselor, or just some complete fraud, or they might even hire their own yes man who is being paid to validate whatever they decide, even if it's shameful, foolish, criminal, or blatantly unbiblical. And this is absolutely shameful and should not happen, but that's what we see here in this passage. So all of these approaches are rooted in an arrogant pride, and either sooner or later will not turn out well. They're just an accident waiting to happen. But a decision on the contrary, let's look at the positive side of this, that's made from a place of contentment and humility and seeking God's will, is likely to be a decision that is made with clarity and confidence because it's infused with God's wisdom, and is less likely to turn out, or is likely to turn out well. So God's will for us in the new year is that we put ourselves in His Word. Let's put this up here. We put ourselves in His Word, not simply to read it, though that's really important. That is step one. But then also to take that next step to insert ourselves into each situation that we read about. So like, let's say we're reading in Judges chapter 18, and we're looking at this account, and we're like, okay, how do I see myself in this? So step 2 is to prayerfully ask the Lord to use Scripture as an honest mirror that we might turn from negative examples. So we see someone engaging in something like this, and we're like, oh, that's just wrong. Or certain attitudes or actions that underlie those negative examples. And instead embrace the positive examples of faithfulness that we might be found similarly faithful. So on the one hand, our prayer is, Lord, when I see these things, Lord, help me see if that is present in my life and I'm just missing it, right? We're always blind to sin in self. We're quick to see it in others and slow to see it in self. So Lord, help me to see these negative attitudes and actions that I'm reading about. Or on the positive side, someone exercising great faith, someone being biblically diligent and found righteous in the eyes of the Lord. Help me, Lord, that I may be found similarly faithful. So great application that we can make as we go through Scripture. Looking then to verse 8, then the spies came back to their brethren at Zorah and Eshtaol, and their brethren said to them, oh, and I forgot to mention that this town Laish is like off the map. It's outside of the allotted territory that God gave any of the tribes. This is some like foreign people living north of the Sea of Galilee. They go and they look for territory just way off in the boondocks. So verse 8, they come back all the way, they track all the way back down south to their people in the south, in these towns of the original location of the tribe of Dan, and they tell their countrymen, they ask them, okay, how did it look? What's your report back? And they answer, arise, let us go up against them. For we have seen the land, and indeed it is very good. Would you do nothing? Like, why are you sitting around? Let's get going. Don't hesitate to go and enter and possess the land. Like, we're going to take it. And the reason this is such a thug mentality is in the worldview of paganism, if there's something that you want and it seems like you can attain it, you just do it. You just grab it, and well, nobody stopped me. Whether it was right or not didn't matter to them. And so, that's the gangster mentality. It's just, well, it was there for the taking, and I took it. Verse 10, when you go, you will come to a secure people and a large land, for God has given it into your hands. That's their theological analysis, or their rationale, we should say. A place where there is no lack of anything that is on the earth. So it did. It had some springs, the headwaters of the Jordan River. It was a decent place of land, but it wasn't God's will. God had not given it into their hands. He had given them the territory of basically Philistia. They were to have the coastal territory, but they abandon that and go after this place, thinking that God has given it to them because they set their mind on it. Let's look ahead to verse 11. And 600 men of the family of Danites went out from there, from Zorah and Eshtaol, armed with weapons of war. So they have a standard-sized combat unit that we read about in the book of 1 Samuel, 600 men in number. It would roughly equate to a battalion in today's modern military, at least American military terms. That would be the equivalent size. And so from this point on, they go up and they make the attack, and we're going to find out what happens next time. But basically, the tribe of Dan is never again found in the south part of Israel, in the territory that God actually gave them. They abandoned it, and they sought out different territory for themselves, and it really was disastrous. But looking at verse 12, then they went up. Let's see. So first they armed themselves, and then the first night they encamp at a place in Kiriath Jearim in Judah, and they named it Manahe Dan, which would be Camp Dan. Basically, you've heard of Camp David. Well, this is Camp Dan, which was apparently a well-known location. If you remember back in Samson, which, this isn't completely chronological. These things were happening all at the same time. That's one of the locations that Samson goes to. So a well-known location from this point. It becomes known by this name, Manahe Dan. Menahaim is a camp. And there it is, west of Kiriath Jearim. So it's about 8 miles away. That's where they stay the first night. And then verse 13, they passed from there to the mountains of Ephraim and came to the house of Micah. So the 5 of them had already seen this location. It was apparently the big compound in town. The family was wealthy and prominent, and so it seemed like a natural choice. If you're going to stay somewhere, let's go look to maybe see if we can stay with them. And this verse 13, which is where we're going to conclude for this week, is preparing us for the fact that the Danites are about to meet up with this personal Levite once again. So we'll just kind of leave it hanging there, but we'll conclude with this. That in this passage, we observe that the threat to the nation of Israel has been, again, external, but now it's internal. So we need to remember that the threat comes not from without, but from within, and it's a spiritual problem. That it's not foreign enemies that are causing the problem. It's not Baal worship that's creeping in that's causing the problem. In this particular instance, it's from within. It's the danger of spiritual, unclarity. It's mixing the pagan practices from around with the true worship of the Lord and blending it all together and assuming that the Lord must be okay with it, even though it's blatantly unbiblical. It involves these idols. It's just a mess. So for us, God's will for us is that we, with his help, would become aware of what and how we worship in our daily lives. So we think, that was syncretism for them back then in that place. In Judges 18, they were mixed up in paganism. They were mixing things. They were getting idolatrous. They were getting things all twisted around. But that can happen to us as well. So perhaps the greatest threat to our walk with him is not an overt abandonment. We just full on reject the faith, but that we have this covert adoption of the attitudes, thinking, and perspective of a culture and an era that has no place for God and his ways. And so if the mantra and the conventional wisdom of the culture and the perspective all around us is coming from a place that's unbiblical, it's going to clash with our biblical worldview, and we don't want to be swayed with that. We need God's discernment and wisdom to show us that this is not coming from him. This is not in accordance with his ways, that he has something very different for us, and that we need to look to him alone, to his word, his ways, his principles, and to be on guard against those perspectives of the culture or the era in which we live. Every decade seems to have its own flavor and what it promotes and what it condones and everything. There was actually, I have to leave with this. There's actually I think it was a Babylon Bee just recently. They were making fun of, within Christianity, there are denominations that have gone in a very, some call it liberal, but I just would say it's probably better described as unbiblical direction. And now, as we're actually seeing our culture become a bit more conservative in certain respects, those churches that changed for the culture are now finding themselves on the outside of a bigger movement. And so I thought that's actually funny because, churches are quick to change for the culture. Well, the culture says we should do this, or we should embrace this, or we should condone that. And, then they think that they're going to somehow, become in good graces with the unbelieving world or whatever their philosophy is, their thinking is. It always backfires. But just a reminder that God's ways are right and true. His word is supernatural, and it stands the test of time, and it's powerful, and we can stand on it regardless of the whims and the waves and the changes that come about through our culture in various eras. So just a good reminder for us in this new year to stick with the Lord and with what we know to be true, and to be on guard for those attitudes that are displeasing to him and that are coming from an unbiblical standpoint, from people that don't have a perspective of him and his ways. We'll conclude there for this week. We'll pick it up next time, and we'll close in prayer, and then we will have our final song this morning. Lord, thank you for this time we've had in your word. I pray that you would use this passage in maybe an unusual passage where we've read it before and haven't maybe made that jump of internalizing it, but to look to how it applies to us and how we can make application of it. Lord, I pray that you would use your word as a mirror. Show us the things that we need to see, whether they reflect back good or bad, but areas where we need improvement by your grace and by your help. And Lord, may we look to you. May we seek after wisdom in the new year. May we seek to be people that live lives honoring to you and that are available to be used of you to serve you and not self, that we would do what is right in your eyes and not in our own eyes. Lord, we pray that you would do that powerful work in each of us and as a congregation. We ask all of this in Jesus' name. Amen.